the mighty Djinn, the solemn Tao, the callous Efreeti, and the enigmatic Marid. The four primary members of the Genie race are born on the elemental planes of existence when a wandering soul bonds with the essence of one of the four elements. The Djinn are born on the wind, destined to rule the plane of air. Tao are born in the stone and rock within the plane of earth. Efreeti come to be amid the burning heat of the fire plane, and Marid emerge from the waves of the plane of water. However, there is a fifth outcome not known to most. Very rarely, a soul will fail to bond with any element and find itself drifting in solitude. As is often the case with such lost souls, it may end up in the Shadowfell, and when that soul bonds with the essence of Shadow, something truly remarkable happens. Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that goes over your favorite old school D&D monster lore, ecology, plot hooks, encounter design, and ultimately converts those creatures into 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. By the end of this video, I hope you'll have a whole new appreciation and understanding of today's monster, which is none other than the Khayal. So, what exactly is a kale? Well, despite the sound of its name, it is indeed not a cruciferous leafy vegetable. It is, however, an obscure, oft-forgotten genie. They first appeared in the Tome of Magic, which was printed in 2006. I went over the contents of this book at length in my Word Archon video, and much like the Word Archon, this is the one and only appearance of this monster in all of D&D history, which means that the only official artwork we have is this. Now that is how a gentleman holds a sword. As the intro of this video alluded to, when we talk about genies, the first thing most people think of is this guy, the Djinn, which of course is a genie aligned with the elemental plane of air. The other 3 primary genies are usually next in line for consideration, but altogether there are actually 8 different genies printed throughout D&D's history. Now, I've already done a video about the Jan, which are genies comprised of all 4 elements into one, but you've also got the Kurashi, which are genies aligned with the element of ice, tasked genies, which are kind of their own weird thing, and of course, the Khayal, which in stark contrast to the Jan, are genies which align with shadow. Now, in the Great Wheel cosmology, the plane of shadow, or the Shadowfell, is considered to be the absence of just about everything, including the 4 elements. And it is among the shadow of all things forgotten that the Khayal reside. There is a ton to unpack about this creature, their society, and what they have to offer to a dungeon master who wants to include them in their game. So to start things off, let's talk about their relationship with the other genie races and where they fit in the genie family tree. Now, as elemental beings aligned with the element of shadow, they're somewhat of a contradiction. They are regarded by the rest of genie kind as outsiders or other. And this is an outlook that even the Khayal hold of themselves. Because of this, they don't really have much of a relationship, good or bad, with any of the other genie races, the one exception being the Jan. Jan live on the material plane, and as I mentioned, they are genies aligned with all 4 elements. Now, the Khayal are extremely hostile towards them, fighting what the original text refers to as a hidden war against the Jan, which has been going on for eons. Why do they fight this war? We simply just don't know. But if I had to guess, at the very least, on a cosmic scale, their elemental nature is completely opposed to one another. The Jan, of course, are beings of all elements, while the Khayal are void made sentient, souls bound with shadow. Something the Khayal do have in common, though, with the other genie races is that lovable arrogance and a tendency to look down on most mortal races. True to form, the Khayal consider themselves above all mortal races, and they will gladly tell you to your face that they are superior. Now, this might not be too off base for an interaction with a genie, but one thing that runs red through Khayal society is their penchant for deception. They consider lying to be a fine art, and a well-crafted lie is thought of as something to be appreciated. They take great joy in deceiving lesser beings just for the hell of it sometimes, and as such, they are consummate liars. However, there is another tradition within their culture that serves to punish those who fail in their deception. If a kay-uhl is ever presented with irrefutable proof that they have told a lie, they will be bound in service to the individual who caught them and forced to perform some type of deed on their behalf. Like other genies, the especially powerful members of their race are able to grant wishes, so in some cases being caught in a lie might mean that the kay-uhl has to grant a wish to the person who caught them. And of course, in the event that the individual is not of noble Djinni blood and isn't able to grant wishes, they may simply be forced to take on some task assigned by their temporary master. Personally, I feel like if I ever caught a kay-uhl in a lie, it would be delightful to summon them for a tea party. But that's just me. I 100% included that line just to do this Photoshop joke, and I have no regrets about the whole situation. But regardless of their assigned task, the kay-uhl is sure to be angry about it and even seek vengeance on those who bind them into service using this method. Something else of note here is that this predisposition towards lying does not extend to their own kind. They truly think nothing about deceiving a mortal or even a member of one of the other Djinni races. However, they almost never lie to one another. I mean, I guess society has to function somehow. Speaking of kay-uhl society, they make their home in the city of Onyx, which of course is located in the Shadowfell. And this city is a truly fascinating location. It is described as a sprawl of twisting towers which stretch out in all directions, paying no mind to the laws of architecture or physics. In this M.C. Escher-esque metropolis, there are essentially two main districts. The outer district, where the city's marketplaces bustle with all manner of races and travelers, and the central district, which is off limits to everyone but the kay-uhl. The city itself is ruled over by the King of Shadows, a seat always occupied by an exceedingly ancient and powerful kay-uhl lord. The central part of this city from which the king rules is called the Grand Palace of Endings, and if you don't think that's the coolest shit ever, I don't know what to tell you. Now, in kay-uhl society, the King of Shadows formally holds the title of Malik. They're often referred to as Grand Malik so-and-so. However, their domain is not limited to the Onyx City, for the kay-uhl Empire stretches across all of the Shadowfell. There are plenty of other towns and cities which are all ruled by kay-uhl lords who hold the title of Emir. And each of these lesser lords, of course, is beholden to the true King of Shadows, the Malik of the Onyx City. So ultimately, just to summarize what we've learned so far, we have a shirked Djinni race that occupies the Shadowfell, has an entire city and society there, a penchant for telling lies, and tons of room for interpretation regarding their history. Do you guys smell that? That smells like a viable D&D monster to me. So now that we have a general understanding of who the kay-uhl are and where they come from, I want to go over its actual abilities, mechanics, and how I converted it into 5th edition from 3.5. As always, my 5th edition stat block is linked in the description below, so if you do ultimately decide that you want to use this monster, everything you'll need to run it in your game is right there. Also, if you are enjoying the video thus far, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or even subscribing if you're new here, because boy howdy does it help me out a whole bunch. Now, let's move along and talk about kay-uhl are swift and confident combatants. They truly believe with every fiber of their being that they are superior in all things to most other creatures, and that should be reflected in how they fight. Now, it should come as no surprise that to a kay-uhl, the concept of a fair fight is simply laughable. They are more than willing to use every tool in their arsenal to great effect. So just what kind of abilities do these Shadow Genies have? Well, let's take a look. Clocking in with a challenge rating of 11, they are on the same power level as the other genies found in the monster manual. They can of course make a few scimitar attacks every round, which is nothing particularly special, but they do also have access to the sneak attack trait, which works exactly the same way as the rogue class feature of the same name. If they're able to get an attack in against a creature when they have advantage, or when that creature is in melee range of another another creature allied to the Khayal, they get to add 4d6 damage to the attack roll. This ability, of course, only functions once per round, and it is great for the first round of combat, but unless you have a way to truly capitalize on it, you might run into some trouble. But don't you worry, our friend here has plenty of ways to make it happen. For starters, the Khayal has access to the Darkness spell, which normally isn't that big of a deal. But due to its Eyes of the Dark trait, it can actually see through the magical darkness it creates. That's going to be very helpful in combat, but during the lead up to an ambush, the Khayal has a few other useful spells, not the least of which is Pass Without Trace. For those of you watching who have never played a Ranger, Pass Without Trace grants the user and any of their allies within 30 feet a flat +10 bonus to stealth checks. Considering the Khayal has a +9 to stealth, that means on a natural 1, the Djinni is going to come away with a 10 total, and its average is going to be a 20.
Hey, that's pretty good.
When it comes to raw damage potential, those sneak attacks are going to be central to the Khayal's path to victory, along with some of the other spells in its arsenal, of course. Now, the final thing I want to talk about on the Khayal's stat sheet is its Umbral State ability. Every Djinni has one sort of big action they can take that is in tune with their elemental nature. For an example of what I mean, let's look at the Djinni's ability called Create Whirlwind. It's a being of elemental air, and it does a big thing that involves manipulating air. The Khayal is capable of using an action called Umbral State to essentially become a living shadow for up to 1 hour at a time. While in this state, the Djinni is incorporeal, meaning it can pass through solid objects and it gains resistance to all non-magical damage. And it imposes disadvantage on any attack rolls made against it. Now this might all seem really good, which it definitely is, but the one glaring weakness on the Khayal's stat block is the fact that they're vulnerable to radiant damage. This means that at any moment, they're liable to be just deleted by a paladin who gets a lucky crit and decides to smite. But there are ways around this. Another of the spells I chose to include on the Khayal's spell list is Shadow of Moil, which grants resistance to radiant damage along with a few other protective benefits. Because at the end of the day, the Khayal is certainly not as beefy or as deadly as any of the other Djinnis in a toe-to-toe fight. But by using its skills in a clever way, it has potential to be the deadliest member of the entire Djinni family. Now, let's talk about how to actually use the darn thing. Anytime you're using a Djinni in a game of Dungeons & Dragons, you have a ton of options at your fingertips. Personally, I love Djinnis. I tend to use them frequently in my games, and I think that any of the tropes which work for the Djinn or the Efreeti can work just as well for the Khayal, but of course with a shadowy twist. The original monster entry also mentions that the Khayal might offer to assist a mortal or a group of mortals who have impressed it in some way with their deceptive nature. Maybe the party manages to pull off some type of grand heist, stealing some kind of valuable magic artifact from a highly protected vault. If you're running Dragon Heist and looking for a follow-up, this plot hook is for free. Now, once the heist is over, they find themselves face to face with a Khayal who has decided to honor them by granting them service in its latest scheme. Perhaps the Khayal even set up the whole thing as some sort of weird audition. What I mean by that is maybe the Djinni themselves placed this valuable treasure inside the vault, hired some guards, set up some traps, and then spread word far and wide about this treasure, awaiting for a group of thieves talented enough to take it for themselves. Then he finds the culprits and offers them a job, maybe even allowing them to keep the thing they stole as the first payment. If you want to do something a little bit more political, I could see an adventure taking place almost entirely within the city of Onyx. Maybe the party gets wrapped up in some Djinni politics for one reason or another, or maybe the party's even chasing down a villainous Khayal relating to something that happened on the material plane, and they learn once they get to the Onyx City the only way to really stop them is to catch them in a lie. And maybe they do, but now they have to prove it, so they take the Khayal to court in the city and they have to prove that they were lied to in front of a jury of the kay-uhl's peers. And if they are successful, they can bind that creature into their service and hopefully undo whatever damage was done back on the material plane. If you want to involve some other genies, maybe the party gets caught up in a conflict between the kay-uhl and the Jan. They might have to unravel some type of sinister kay-uhl plot. Maybe the Jan aren't even aware of it and they have to convince them that this threat is real. And even if you decide not to use them as the focus of an adventure or a campaign, anytime a party is traveling through the Shadowfell, having an encounter with a kay-uhl could be something really interesting, and I think it will leave an impression on your players for sure. I love the idea of the Onyx City just as a location, and I think some kay-uhl NPCs would be a really great fit for any game taking place there. I also feel it's worth mentioning that with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, we now have the Pact of the Djinni as an option available to warlocks. So maybe consider, instead of just the 4 typical genies which are already available, allowing your warlock to make a pact with the King of Shadows or some other powerful kay-uhl genie. In terms of how that works mechanically, I would give them a different spell list that has spells all shadowy in nature. And while we're on the topic of player options, what about Shadow Genassi? I mean, if we have Elemental Genassi for all the other elements aligned with genies, it makes sense that there might be a Shadow Genassi born as the result of some dormant kay-uhl blood somewhere in their lineage. Right? Well, you don't have to imagine it, because I love this idea so much that I went ahead and included rules for both a kay-uhl warlock spell list and the Shadow Genassi in the Google document, so definitely be sure to check those out as well. But all in all, that's basically everything I've got for you today. As I mentioned, there is a link in the description of this video that will lead you to my 5th edition conversion of this monster, along with all the rules for Shadow Genassi and the expanded spells. Also, if you are one of my lovely patrons, you will find the 5th edition Monster Manual style stat block over on the Patreon page. If you're not already a patron, please consider checking it out, because you get a fancy stat block once a week and it helps me eat food. Speaking of patrons, it is time for Patron of the Week. Thank you very much to Randy Wells. I deeply appreciate your patronage. And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video today, and be sure to leave a comment with your kay-uhl plot hooks and ideas. I cannot wait to see what you all come up with. Also, if you do have a monster recommendation for a creature you'd like to see show up on this channel in the future, either leave a comment or tell me about it on Discord or get at me on Twitter, and who knows, you might just see that creature show up on Monster of the Week. But that is all for today, so until next time.